Thank you so much. If you watch my videos, it means a lot to me. And I wanted to come on here because there has been a lot of things that have been going on in the news lately. Things that are pretty scary, and it just feels like the world is unpredictable because there's like people out there that apparently are plotting to do like evil things at any given moment. And yeah, like recently I saw a news story about something that happened in a nearby city where I live. And yeah, the news is full of stories about people that are doing evil things to other people, and like the only explanation that we're given is, well, they had a lot of hate or they had a lot of anger. And really, like when we read that or we hear that on the news, it's like that kind of gives us sort of closure. Like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Like that's the only possible explanation we can like accept for why someone could possibly do something like that. Or also, that they're mentally ill is also something that a lot of people put out there as a reason. And I want to discuss with you like how it's possible for us to be in a culture where, or a country even, where we want to separate like Christianity from our public life, from our government, the kinds of laws we pass. Like we don't want any Christianity to influence the laws that we pass, or like no teaching about Christianity in schools, or even like our lifestyle. Like we want to separate our Christian beliefs with how we are living our life. But even if this is the case and that's the country that we live in, I want to just ask you, do you think that it's possible for us as a society to learn something about anger based off of what we are taught in the Bible? So like, is there something that we as a country can learn and can benefit from learning that is found and taught in the Bible? And I want to talk about why anger is a big deal in our in our daily lives. It's obvious, like all of these crimes that are happening, like there's a lot of anger out there, right? But why also is anger a big deal to God? And we can see what Jesus taught us about anger in Matthew 5:21-22. He said, "You have heard that it was said to our people long ago, 'You must not murder anyone. Anyone who murders another will be judged.' But I tell you, if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be judged. If you say bad things to a brother or sister, you will be judged by the council. And if you call someone a fool, you will be in danger of the fire of hell." Why is Jesus putting anger in the same category as like murder? Why is he talking about these two things together? Jesus is, referencing the sixth commandment that prohibits premeditated murder. And under the Old Testament, it was punishable with the death penalty. God made it clear from the start that premeditated murder was just something people were not to do. And the reason for this is because human beings are created in the image of God. And I think we can all agree that this is so right. Even if you aren't a Christian, even if you maybe have another religion, I think we generally accept that premeditated murder is wrong and that nobody should do it. And even like when it is done, like there's this sense that we all have, like we want justice, you know? But anger seems like, to us, it seems like something that is so less serious than murder. But actually, anger is a pretty big deal to God. And Jesus is discussing this issue of anger with us and telling us, hey, this anger thing that you guys do among yourselves, it's a big deal. And the reason for this is that anger usually leads to a desire to damage or destroy another person, either in some personal way or literally in the form of murder. The situation that happened in a nearby city, the lieutenant described the person as someone full of anger. And even this lieutenant made that connection that his anger led to the murder of innocent people. But again, we all agree, yeah, that kind of level anger, that level of anger that a person is capable of, like doing something so heinous like that, yeah, that's wrong. But the kind of anger that we, experience like in our own daily life, like there's maybe that's not as bad as this other anger. So Jesus says that calling someone a fool is actually you doing something out of your anger, and that it's destructive. You're attacking someone's character and identity in doing so. And Jesus warns that whoever does this is in danger of the fire of hell. So we might tell ourselves that our anger is not that big of a deal, but Jesus straight up told us that it is a big deal and it could have eternal implications. So if everybody followed what Jesus teaches about anger, that means that there would be no murder, right? There would be no one calling anybody any kind of insults. There would be no violence. Would there be any road rage? Or how would our relationships look like? Would there be any child abuse or domestic violence? Would there be abortions? There wouldn't be any evil if everyone followed what Jesus is teaching on anger. And imagine walking around without all of these fears that people are having on a daily basis. I think we could benefit from learning about Jesus' teachings on anger and all his other teachings, really. It's relevant to our country. It's relevant to our students. It's relevant to our children. And, in the Bible, it teaches us about praying for our leaders, respecting authority. It teaches children to obey their parents. It teaches people not to do all these terrible things to other people. It teaches people to love one another. Why do we want to separate that message from our society, from our culture? That sounds very unwise. You can teach something, you can learn something without forcing someone to believe it. You can still learn from Christianity. You can still learn from the Bible. You can still learn from Jesus. You can even live your life based off of the things that Jesus teaches. And maybe not even know that, oh, these are some of the things that Jesus is all about. Learning how to deal with anger seems like something that every single person on this planet needs to learn how to do. And in James 1:19 through 20, it says, "My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires." So when we're angry, that anger is not going to bring about like good behavior. It's going to do the opposite. Often when we're angry, we don't think clearly in those moments. The adrenaline is rushing and we just want to say or do something impulsively, something that we know we'll regret later. So it's very wise for us to learn to be slow to anger. And notice that it says be slow to anger, because anger is not the problem. The problem is what you do when you are angry. In fact, there are several parts in the Bible that talk about God's own wrath. But since God is good, what he does in his anger is actually justice, and it's for the good of everyone. Us, on the other hand, when we're angry, we have all these evil tendencies that we need to learn to control. And this is not just for people that have like obvious anger management issues. It's for like all of us. Consider this. What do you do when someone disrespects you? Do you retaliate verbally? Or like, are you even like tempted to like get physical in that moment? What do you do when your child keeps disobeying you? Do you yell and resort to violence? Are you too rough with your children in a moment of impatience? What do you do when someone cuts you off on the road? Do you call the person a name? I can remember a moment when I felt so disrespected, and I didn't imagine it. It happened. And oh man, your heart pumps faster and harder. The adrenaline rushes, and you just want to like retaliate. You know, like we're quick to come up with like a comeback. Like those thoughts just come right away. But like, thank God something in us like tells us don't do that. And we can pause we can be silent in that moment instead of saying what we want to say, doing what we want to do. We can wait. It's just a matter of if we're going to do it. And although anger allows us to know that something wrong has happened, Jesus still teaches us not to retaliate. In Matthew 5:38 through 42, he said, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you." So in the Old Testament, God established this law of retaliation, which is what he's referring to as an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. It was actually God's idea to have this law of retaliation, but it was a means of maintaining justice and purging evil from among the people. It was intended to prevent inappropriate punishment, so the punishment had to fit the crime. And it was imposed by civil authorities rather than individuals. Jesus is not prohibiting the use of force by governments, police, or soldiers when combating evil. Instead, what Jesus is focusing on here is on the individual conduct, and he's prohibiting the universal human tendency to seek personal revenge. He's actually referring to a backhanded slap given as an insult, that a right-handed person would slap someone on the right cheek. And Jesus says one should not return an insulting slap, which would lead to escalating violence. Jesus is not talking about like self-defense or like running away from evil. Like that's not what Jesus was referring to when he said that. Perhaps we don't receive backhanded slaps as insults in our culture. Hopefully you don't, because that would be really wrong and you could go to jail for that if someone did that. But we do have a lot of verbal insults going on in our culture, in our personal lives, maybe even in our day-to-day. And we can apply the same principle that Jesus is teaching us. So if we return an insult for an insult, if I were to have said what I wanted to say in that moment where I felt where I was insulted, I would have just started something that would have just continued to escalate and cause like more damage than what was already caused to me. And Jesus himself applied what he taught. We can see that in John 18:22 through 23. When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him in the face. "Is this the way you answer the high priest?" he demanded. "If I said something wrong," Jesus replied, "testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me?" Jesus didn't retaliate either by force physically, nor did he like retaliate by like insulting him verbally. But he did speak the truth in that moment. He did like hold that person accountable for what he did, and he did call him out on his wrongdoing in that moment. So that's a beautiful example of how Jesus had this self-control and didn't let anger control him. And in the Bible, we have another example, but it's one that we can learn from his mistake, and it's the story of Moses. And there's a part in the Bible that we find Moses in this situation where he acted out in anger, and the result was not good. In Numbers 20, him and the people in the desert were in a situation where there was no water in sight. And the people assembled together, and they were coming against Moses and Aaron, and they quarreled with Moses. So it wasn't just one person, but it was like a bunch of people like coming against Moses. And I can imagine Moses himself must have been like feeling like in a desperate situation, physically probably as well. And now on top of that, he had this like emotional thing going on as well, and possible threat. But it says that, so in that situation, Moses and Aaron went before God. And it says that after the Lord had given them instructions, Moses and Aaron instead spoke with anger at the people, and they disobeyed God. So it says that then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, "Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock?" And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice, and water came out abundantly. And the congregation drank, and their livestock. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not believe in me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them." What I can learn from this situation is how, in the heat of anger, we can insult others with the same word that would apply to us in that moment of lack of self-control that we are having. They called them rebels, and they themselves were about to rebel against what God instructed them to do. Instead of speaking to the rock like God had told them to do, God was going to bring water out of this rock when they spoke to it. But Moses decided to strike the rock twice. And he also, before he did that, he took the credit away from God. And yeah, he didn't shine the light to God, who was the ultimate provider in that moment. That situation was supposed to bring glory to God. And instead, his anger just like made him lose sight of like proper perspective, like who he is, who God is, and although he found himself in these really difficult circumstances, he was still expected to obey God, and so are we. no matter what the circumstances are, no matter how, how much we want to do something in our anger, we are still expected to do the right thing, to be obedient to God. When we sin in anger, we lose sight of who we are, and we put ourselves in a dangerous place where we can fail to obey God and ultimately bring negative consequences upon ourselves, like Moses did. Unfortunately, he did not get to go into that promised land as a result of this situation, this lack of self-control, and this moment of anger that he had. In our case, being wrongly blamed for something or insulted, these things can linger for years. They're very hurtful, and they not only affect us emotionally but physically. It can bring on so much stress, depression, maybe anxiety. And we can understand why God doesn't want us to be angry towards each other. And instead of retaliating, He wants us to respond with forgiveness in obedience to God. And if we can commit to live this out in our personal lives, we can serve as an example to our children, our spouses, family, neighbors, students, strangers, and ultimately even our country. The next opportunity we get, let's remember to be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. And maybe if enough people can live this out and teach it to other people, hopefully things can turn around and we don't have to see so many things on the news as a result of anger.